In 1979, a man called Issa Harel, who's known as the father of Israeli intelligence, did an interview with an American journalist in which he predicted that there would be an Arab attack on New York's biggest building. He had in mind the Empire State Building, but of course the biggest buildings on 9/11 were the Twin Towers. Also in 1979, Benjamin Netanyahu organized a conference in Jerusalem to call for a war on terrorism. Father Bush attended it. And for preemptive strikes against terrorist states before they did any terrorism. In 1984, Benjamin Netanyahu organized another one in America, and it was attended by the American government and military elite, calling for a war on terrorism. He wrote a book around the same time. In 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was prime minister of Israel by 1996, and a group of ultra-Zionists, led by a guy called Richard Pearl, produced a document for Netanyahu called A Clean Break, Securing the Realm being Israel, which called for Saddam Hussein to be removed from Iraq, which called for Syria and Iran to be targeted, and said that the more inter-Arab conflict we can create, the better. A year later, 1997, an organization was created in America called the Project for the New American Century. One of its key members was Richard Pearl, who did the Clean Break. And the co-founders of the Project for the New American Century were William Crystal, ultra-Zionist, and Robert Kagan, ultra-Zionist. Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was the State Department's head of Eurasian Affairs, who oversaw the American coup in Ukraine. Everything connects. It's a very small world with this cult. So that started in 1997. In 1998, this same group wrote to President Clinton calling for Saddam Hussein to be overthrown in Iraq. We're starting to get the picture. In the year 2000, in September 2000, this Project for the New American Century, among whose members were Dick Cheney, who would be 9/11 de facto president, officially vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, who would be 9/11 defense secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, who would be his deputy, but the real power in the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim, who would control ultra-Zionist, who would control the whole of the Pentagon budget at time of 9/11. And on September the 10th, the day before the attacks, the Pentagon announced that they'd lost $2.3 trillion. It had just gone missing, right? Well, I've got an idea what some of it was spent on, chaps. But anyway, and of course they announced it on September the 10th, and not many people heard about it because something happened the next day, which these people knew was going to happen, of course. That's why they did it on the 10th. So this is what you had, this group of people. Also among the Project for the New American Century was Richard Pearl, Netanyahu's mate, who wrote Clean Break, and John Bolton, who's been calling, until he got removed by Trump, all along has been calling for regime change in a series of Arab countries. He's never seen a country he didn't want to bomb, John Bolton. So that's document that this Project for the New American Century produced in September 2000 called for a series of countries to be regime changed using American troops. And basically, the foundation of it was what was in the clean break, securing the realm of Israel. So instead of using Israeli troops, they wanted to use American troops to do what benefited Israel, what benefited the cult, basically. And so they wanted regime change in September 2000 in Iraq, Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and other countries, including North Korea, leading eventually to regime change in China. And that was what they wanted. They called in this document, and it was an ultra-Zionist organization, the Project, the New American Century. They called for American troops to fight and decisively win multiple theater wars in these countries to regime change. But they also said in this document, September 2000, that this, what they called in the quote, process of transformation, regime change, would necessarily be slow because they wouldn't have the support to do it, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year to the month after that document was published, 9 months after these people came to power with Bush, America had what Bush called at the time the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century, 9/11. And as a result of those attacks, these countries have been ticked off ever since in what was called, quoting Netanyahu back in the 70s and 80s, a war on terror. According to the New York Times, I'm taking through a timeline here. According to the New York Times, on September the 19th and 20th, 2001, immediately after the attacks, this same group of people I'm talking about, operating under the defense, a defense organization out of the Pentagon, decided that Saddam Hussein had to be removed from Iraq. So you're seeing the progression here. Then we have General Wesley Clark, who was a former Supreme Commander of NATO, who went on an kind of alternative internet TV program called Democracy Now! In 2007, and described his experience immediately after 9/11. He said he went to the Pentagon, he met Rumsfeld, he met Wolfowitz, and then went down and met a general friend of his in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the uniform level of the Pentagon hierarchy. And this general, he said, told him days after 9/11 they were going to invade Iraq. Well, that kind of fits because that's where we've been leading. And you can see where the Iraq thing came from now. His question was, why are we going to invade Iraq? Had everything to do with 9/11? They said, well, we don't think so, but we're going to invade Iraq. It's coming from upstairs. So Clark goes away, comes back a few weeks later, by which time America's in Afghanistan. And by the way, within an hour or so of the attacks, Ehud Barak, brackets, friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who was the Prime Minister of Israel into the early months of 2001. He went on the BBC immediately after the attacks and pointed the finger for them at Osama bin Laden and talked about an invasion of Afghanistan, right? This is a guy who was also a massive figure in Israeli intelligence. So they're in Afghanistan by now. And he says he went back, Clark. He said he went back and he met his general friend again, who said, well, he said to him, why haven't we invaded Iraq? I thought we were going to invade Iraq. He said, it's worse than that, sir. He said, we just had this from upstairs. And he pulled up a piece of paper, Clark said, and he said, we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And the countries he named were all from the Project, the New American Century document in September 2000. They included Syria, and which was also on the Project the American Century document, Assad, getting rid of him, Libya, Syria, all of them, they were all there, Iran, etc. And so you see the cult's influence in the sense that at the time of 9/11, you had Bush, Republican, in the White House, and you had Blair, Labour, it says here, in Downing Street, and they invade Afghanistan, and then they invade Iraq. Oh, Benjamin, you got it at last after all this time, right? On a lie, of course. And people say, why did they lie about weapons of mass destruction? Because it's on the list and they don't have an excuse, so they made one up to tick it off the list. It is simple when you realize how it works. But then Blair goes and Bush goes. And in comes Bush's opponent, Obama, Democrat, and in comes Blair's opponent, Cameron, Conservative. And they pick off Libya and then start the process of the catastrophe of a fake civil war orchestrated by the same forces we've talked about, the paid mercenary terrorists, etc., in Syria. And then they go. And in comes the maverick Trump. And I put it on the internet when he came to power, key word of Trump's administration, Iran. And of course, they've been targeting Iran vehemently and actually had planes in the air to attack them at one point a few weeks ago before Trump pulled it back. Overwhelmingly, it seems to me, from the circumstances of the time, because it had been pointed out to him the consequences electorally of him invading Iran, given that he got to power to a massive extent by saying he was going to stop all that nonsense, right? Anyway, but now they're doing it with sanctions and trying to create unrest and protests that turn into people regime change.